my pleasure to introduce Malin Pinsky. Malin is a recent professor at Rutgers University. He did his bachelor's at Williams. He did his PhD at Stanford at the Hopkins Marine Lab. And he did his postdoc under the prestigious David H. Smith Conservation Fellowship with Jorge Sarmiento, Simon Levin at Princeton University, working with colleagues at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, looking at the effects of climate change on fish and fisheries. So he's going to be talking about that today. And I'm excited to say that Malin was the lead PI on a regional sea grant that we got with Hayami Kim and myself to look at the effects of climate change on summer flounder, which is a really important species for New York and the rest of the East Coast. So with that, I'll let Malin take it away.
Great. Thanks, Janet. And thanks for the invitation to come out here. This is my first time out to Stony Brook, and I've had a fantastic morning talking to some of you, and look forward to meeting more of you this afternoon. Is the microphone working?
Yeah,
okay.
Is that good and that?
Yeah, we're going to change the lights too.
Yeah,
Okay.
we're going to put on
Mood lighting.
Nice. Cool. So broadly, the work that I do integrates tools from modeling field ecology and genetics to understand population dynamics of coastal marine species. And the questions that fascinate me, I think, are those at the core of ecology and conservation. What drives the distribution and abundance of species? How will these patterns change in the future? And what influence do we have on them? And part of the reason that I'm at least interested in these questions is because I think the answers really matter to us as well. 2 out of 5 people globally rely in large part on protein that comes from marine species. And here in the US, fisheries support close to 2 million jobs. So on the other hand, understanding population dynamics in marine species has traditionally been very difficult. Most marine species have a complex life cycle where there's a distinct adult and larval stage. And ecological processes can affect the dynamics at any point in that life cycle. So adults produce larvae that disperse with ocean currents for days or months. The survival of those offspring and growth depends on habitat, environmental conditions, so gradient is what that's representing, as well as interactions with other species, all of which can impose selective pressures that influence local adaptation and evolutionary dynamics. And then we as well influence these systems very strongly, especially through fishing, though in other ways as well. But it's not just a one-way impact. We are also impacted by and affected, our behavior is affected by the dynamics and distribution of these and the status of these ecosystems. So we often have to think about these really as coupled human natural systems where we're very much a part of the ecosystem and responding to what's changing. So you can easily spend a career thinking about any one small part of this system, and a very productive career. But I think in many cases the real challenge before us is how do we scale up from understanding small parts of the system, often at small spatial scales and over short time periods, to gain a macroscopic understanding of how the system works, and eventually have some ability to predict where this system is going in the future. So as Janet mentioned, over the last couple of years I've been thinking especially about climate change, and I've been especially interested in what happens to this system when the underlying climate gradient on which it's based starts to shift. And what does that mean for the future of the species in this system and for the goods and services that we are able to get out of the system as well. So one way to think about shifting climates is with something called climate velocity. So I just want to explain briefly what I mean by that. So if you think about a spatial gradient in any environmental condition, by say temperature, warmer at the equator, cooler at the poles, that gradient has some slope. What that means is that if you pick a particular temperature, it has a location. You you could draw that isotherm on a map. And now if that gradient were to warm at some rate, then that isotherm is going to shift across the seascape at some rate. And you can express that speed as kilometers per decade. And that speed and that direction are what make up climate velocity. So our understanding of climate velocities have improved dramatically in recent years. There's, this map was published just a couple years ago. It's global climate velocities for the last 50 years. Areas in dark orange show climate velocities that were upwards of 200 kilometers per decade, so very rapid in some places. But also, as you can see, there's a lot of variation from one place to another around the globe. And there's some places in white where climate velocities were near zero over the last 50 years. So while we're at the point of being able to map physical changes in the environment quite well and starting to be able to project those forward, our understanding of how species and communities and our society are affected by these changes, we still have a long way to go in terms of understanding what those impacts are. So I think there's sort of a few basic questions that are important to ask, and are including the very simple one: do species follow climate velocities? That's been a suggestion. It might be a natural hypothesis, but we actually haven't had much evidence for whether or not that's true. I'm going to spend most of my talk looking at this question and variations, following that question down a few different pathways. But then towards the end, I also want to touch on whether fisheries are affected by shifts in species distributions, and then also actually look at that from the other perspective. Do fisheries affect the ability of species to keep up with climate velocities? Is there an interaction, and are there cumulative impacts there? And then finally, I want to think a little bit about how we might go about adapting marine conservation and fisheries management to the impacts of climate velocity and climate change and shifts in species distributions. So on this first question, one of the reasons I was really interested in it is because while there has been a lot of work on trying to understand how species distributions have been shifting, both in the ocean and especially on land, one of the things that keeps cropping up is that when people look across a large number of species, they often find that many species, including up to 60%, actually are not shifting towards the poles, towards higher elevations, or towards deeper depths, as you might expect from global warming. So there have been a wide range of explanations for why that might be happening. But just to give you a couple examples, this was one study in the North Sea. Each of these bars represents a different species, and what they found was that one species called snake blenny was shifting about twice as fast as cod over the period of that study. And then this is another study, an example from Yosemite National Park, looking at small mammals along an elevational gradient, and they found that some species were expanding their ranges, some were contracting, and a large number actually weren't moving at all. So one explanation might be that there are just maybe very specific differences that affect the sensitivity of species to changes in climate. And it's been hard to understand why some species might be responding and others aren't. And some authors have come to the conclusion that actually it might be very idiosyncratic differences between species, and ultimately very difficult to predict without knowing a lot of very detailed ecology of each species that you're interested in. On the other hand, I showed you earlier that climate velocities actually vary quite a bit from one place to another. So another hypothesis might be that species are responding to different climate velocities in different places. And no one had actually made that comparison. So to be able to compare those two at a relatively fine scale, I pulled together a large amount of information from bottom trawl surveys here in North America. So these are largely conducted by the National Marine Fisheries Service here in the US, or Fisheries and Oceans Canada, up in Canada. And these surveys work by dropping a large net in the water, dragging it close to the bottom, pulling it up, counting and weighing the fish and vertebrates that they catch. And they do this at many places along the continental shelf. The surveys have been going on for quite a long time. Actually, together would end up being quite a fantastic data set. going out near every year in some cases and every few years in other locations. But the longest survey we have is here in the Northeast US, goes back 41 years. They go out actually twice a year. And the other thing they collect on each of these surveys are temperatures, surface and bottom temperatures. So we know not only what's happening at the surface of the ocean, which we can also detect from satellites, but also at the bottom, which has traditionally been much harder to understand. So a fair bit of my postdoc was spent pulling together the surveys from each of the regions shown here in red, so all the way from Alaska down to the Gulf of Mexico and out to Newfoundland. And this was the first time that all these data sets had been pulled together to get a continent, close to continent-wide perspective on how species distributions have been changing over the last few decades. So just to give you a sense for what these data can tell us, this is an example from the Northeast US spring bottom trawl survey. Each of the black dots in this picture shows a place where there was a trawl tow at some point in the survey. There have been, it goes back, as I mentioned, 41 years, close to 9,000 tows at this point. It's about 200 a year, stretching from Cape Hatteras up into the Gulf of Maine. If we are to look at just one species in 1 year, this is American lobster in 2005. Each of these gray X's is a place where lobster wasn't caught in the survey in that year. And each of these black dots, the size is proportional to the biomass of lobster caught at that particular place. So one way to summarize the distribution in that year is just as the mean latitude at which lobster was caught. And then we can do that in each year. And in this case, we see that lobsters actually shifted north quite a bit over the last 40 years. One way, again, to summarize this would just be okay, at what rate was it shifting north? We can just fit a linear regression and look at the slope of that. So we can do this not just for one species at a time, but actually look across a large number of species in the Northeast US. In this map, each of those black dots shows where the center of a species distribution was in the late 1960s. And then each of these arrows show how that range centroid shifted over the subsequent 4 decades. You can see that there's a fair bit of variation from one species to the next, or from one species to the next, as is common in many of these data sets. On average, though, this entire assemblage has been shifting northeast at about 20 kilometers per decade, consistent with warming temperatures that we've been observing over this time period as well. We can also zoom out, look at 9 different regions around North America where we have data sets. And yes, there are a number of regions where the assemblage has been shifting north on average. Eastern Bering Sea being one, Northeast US, Newfoundland as well. But it's interesting. There are actually a number of regions where the assemblages have been shifting south over the last few decades. In fact, there may actually be more regions where they've been shifting south. It might be confusing, but we also have to look at actually how have temperatures been changing in these regions. So on this figure here, you should say each of the dots represents one of the regions, so an assemblage of species within a region. The y-axis is showing how fast that assemblage, so average across all the species, has been shifting north or south. And the x-axis shows you how temperature has been changing, either getting warmer or getting cooler. Now, if you're willing to squint your eyes and maybe ignore some outliers, you can see some general trends where, okay, maybe in regions where temperatures have been warming, assemblages have been shifting north. In other regions where temperatures have been cooling, actually that's where assemblages have been shifting south. So that sort of makes sense. But there's this really interesting outlier in here as well, Gulf of Mexico. So it's actually been warming relatively quickly in the Gulf of Mexico. But this assemblage has been shifting south. If you think about the geography of the Gulf of Mexico, though, it starts to make a lot more sense. So if species here were to shift north, they'd end up in Louisiana. Instead, they've been shifting deeper towards cooler water, which in this geography is taking them south. So if you're willing to exclude the Gulf of Mexico as an outlier, it's the only region where where there's that kind of geographic constraint and it's warming. We can explain actually 60% of the variation among these regions just based on one factor, change in bottom temperature. Turns out we can also explain changes in depth quite well, also based on change in temperature. We can actually explain 80% of the variation among regions just based on change in surface temperature. So it seems like, in this sort of aggregate average way, regional assemblages are tracking changes in temperature. But it doesn't actually tell us whether individual species are tracking climate velocity. So we have to take a little bit different approach to answer that question. So I'm going to show you one example here for silver hake, getting back to the northeast US, since that's where we are. So as before, this map is showing each of these black dots is proportional to the biomass of silver hake caught at each of these locations. This is showing the entire set of the northeast US spring survey. And from these data, we can fit a thermal envelope model, where basically it's a generalized additive model. It's actually broken into two parts to account for how many zeros there are in the data set. But this gives us a sense for how a presence, absence, and abundance of this species scales with temperature. We can then project this model onto a particular set of environmental conditions and observed at some period. So say the 1970s. We can also project it to other time periods as well. This is an example from the 2000s. And then we can actually compare these projections just considering thermal conditions to actually where the species was. In this case, changes in temperature actually seem to have done a reasonably good job predicting why silver hake was lost from many parts of the mid-Atlantic bight between the 70s and the 2000s. So to summarize these kinds of changes, though, across a large number of species, can simplify the change in location of the thermal envelope just into change in mean latitude of that thermal envelope. So I'll show you that on this graph right here, where the x-axis is how fast just that thermal envelope has been shifting north or south. And then on the y-axis, I'm showing you what the species actually did. Where the species were caught, were they shifting north or south over the course of these surveys. So in this graph, each of the gray dots is showing you a taxon from a particular region. And you can see that there are actually a number of taxa that fall in the upper right quadrant. So this is where thermal envelopes were shifting north and species were shifting north. There are also a number of points that fall in the lower left quadrant. So thermal envelopes actually in a number of different places were actually shifting south, and species were shifting south as well. So this red line here is the one-to-one line. So obviously a lot of scatter around that, but these shifts actually tend to be centered around that one-to-one line. It's a highly significant relationship, and actually we can explain close to 40% of the variation among these 325 different taxa just based on climate velocity. So I actually think that's quite an interesting result, in part because it implies that rather than necessarily needing to search for biological or ecological differences to explain all of the variation among these species, part of the story is that these species in different places are experiencing different rates and even different directions of climate velocity. And that variation from one place to the next, from one place to another, and between species is an important part of explaining this variation in how species have been shifting north, south, or maybe not moving at all. So one question I had when I saw this was, well, okay, climate velocity may be shifting quite rapidly in some places. Are species lagging behind climate velocities? So one way to look at that would be to understand whether species are lagging behind or speeding ahead of climate velocity. So if you think about this graph a little bit, any points that fall in this in the lower right corner, so they're predicted to be shifting north, but they're not shifting north as fast as you would expect. So, and any species points that fall in the upper left quadrant are predicted to shift south, but are not shifting south as fast as you would expect. We have the opposite in the other two quadrants. In the upper right quadrant, they're predicted to shift north, and they're shifting north even faster than you would predict. Remember, this line right here is the one-to-one line. Species down here are predicted to shift south, and they're shifting south even faster than we predict. So we can basically, the length of these lines indicate how much they're lagging behind or speeding ahead. On the other hand, you can put these all together, look at a t-test, and on average across all these species, all these marine taxa, they are neither lagging behind or speeding ahead of climate velocities. So at least so far, they're keeping up. Yeah, you have a question?
Does south always mean deeper water depths?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, this is just looking at latitude. So in Gulf of Mexico, it does
Yes.
tend to be deeper, but
Okay.
each of the geographies is different.
Okay.
I didn't put a slide in here, but actually climate velocity does predict changes in depth reasonably well. Not quite as well as changes in latitude, but also significantly related. So there may not be an overall lag. Obviously there are questions about climate velocities becoming faster in the future. Will there be a limit? I think that's to how fast marine species can shift. I think that's an interesting question. There's also a question, are there certain kinds of species that tend to lag behind more than others? So these aren't just anonymous dots on a graph. These actually are species that we know something about. Close to 200 fishes, for example. So we know something about the life history of these species. And I'm just going to show you the analysis for fish right now, because we have better life history information for many of these species than for some of the invertebrates. But one of the things we can do is we can ask, okay, let's just look at speed, the speed at which they're shifting north or south. We'll ignore direction for the moment. So we already know it's somewhat related to climate velocity, so we can account for that. We can also account for some of the differences among surveys. And then try to ask some more ecological questions. Is the speed of shift also related to whether the species are found up in the water column or down close to the bottom, so demersal or pelagic or demersal? Whether they're commercially fished or not? Whether their biomass over the last few decades has been increasing or decreasing? How large the species are, as that might be correlated to their ability to swim as adults? How fast individuals grow, related to population growth rates? Overall size of the range globally, maybe an indicator for physiological plasticity. And finally, where in the food chain they're feeding. So we can put all of this into a multiple linear regression, simplify it down with Akaike's information criterion, and it actually simplifies down a lot. We find that the only factor that's retained is growth rate, at least for fish. And what it implies is that slow-growing species tend to lag behind climate velocity to a greater extent. And actually, it makes a lot of sense. It fits in with what we understand about species ranges that are being colonized. It fits in with theory from invasion biology as well. But I think in this particular case, there's sort of another thing that's important to point out. So this model for fishes explains 42% of the variation among these species. If we were to drop growth rate and just look at climate velocity and the differences among surveys, we can explain 41% of the variation among species. So growth rate is actually not adding very much at all. Really, most of this story is about climate velocity. So I think the take-home message is that this variation from one place to another in the rate and direction of climate velocity is really important influence on how fast and in what direction species are shifting their ranges, potentially giving us a useful tool also projecting forward. So for the next couple parts of the talk, I also really want to focus on the feedbacks between species range shifts and society in both directions, and try to think about this a little bit more as a coupled human-natural system. And I think fisheries really are a nice example of these coupled systems, where behavior of fishermen responds to changes in the environment and vice versa. So the first part of this is just, are fisheries affected by shifts in species range? So this is a study I did with Mike Fogarty, one of my collaborators for my postdoc project. And one of the species, I'm going to show you one particular example to tell this story. And this is red hake, one of the species in the northeast U.S. that's shifted north most rapidly. So in this particular graph, the y-axis is showing the centroid of the red hake distribution in terms of latitude. And then the x-axis is showing you years from 1968 up until 2008. And as you can see, it has shifted north quite rapidly. It used to be centered down in New Jersey, and now it's centered off of Massachusetts. So we can make the same sort of graph, but for fisheries landings. And that's the red line here. And you can see that, yes, the fishery landings have also shifted north, but I think there's actually something a bit more interesting hidden in here as well, which is that up until about 1990, the fishery was shifting north at about the same rate as the species was. But after 1990, red hake continued shifting north into Massachusetts, but the fishery really did not. And in digging into this, it seems like there are a number of reasons for this. One of the reasons is that the fishery tends to use a net with small mesh, and these nets are excluded from many parts of northern New England out of concerns for bycatch. There are few places you can use these nets, but they're relatively few and far between. It also turns out that there aren't many markets for this species up in northern New England. There is a market around here at Fulton Fish Market, but the processors up in northern New England aren't particularly interested in buying the species, and it's actually relatively difficult to truck it all the way down to New York. And there also aren't many fishermen actually who know how to go out and are interested in going out and catching the species. So for a range of, and actually another reason is that the quota, the amount that fishermen in northern New England are allowed to catch is relatively low, and it hasn't changed even as the species has shifted north. So for a range of economic, practical, social, and regulatory reasons, this fishery has lagged quite a bit behind the species. And I think all these factors tend to slow the fishery down. I think it may also have another impact, which is, I think, kind of interesting, which is that if the fishery is lagging behind where the species is shifting, and you're not fishing the leading edge of the species, it can grow relatively rapidly up north, but you're fishing it hard on the trailing end. So in some ways, that actually serves to speed the population north. And in this case, red hake has actually been shifting quite a bit faster than you'd predict just from climate velocity. And it's just a hypothesis, but I think the effective fishing may be part of that reason. So we have looked at a few other species as well, and in each of these cases, we've seen evidence that the fishery is lagging quite a bit behind the fish or invertebrate that they're targeting. So we've looked at not only red hake, but also American lobster, yellowtail flounder, and summer flounder. So I think the take-home message is that for a range of regulatory, economic, and social reasons, fisheries tend to lag behind the fish that they're exploiting. It'll be interesting to see how general this is, as well as try to dig into more of the mechanisms that are at play. We've only looked at fisheries landings, a relatively coarse way to start. So for the next part, I want to flip this question around a little bit and ask, does fishing affect the ability of species to keep up with climate velocity? So this is work that I've been doing in collaboration with two graduate students, Emma Fuller and Eleanor Brush. And we've been starting out just with an ecological model, starting with ecological theory as a way to build our intuition about how these two factors might interact, or what should our intuition be? So it is, as I said, it's quite a simple model. It includes individuals dispersing, their offspring get fished, they reproduce, and then we go around and around. It's all in a one-dimensional habitat, imagining as if it's along a coastline. And the key is that species can only reproduce within their thermal envelope. There's a certain section of the coastline where they're able to reproduce. And over time, the location of that thermal envelope shifts north. So that's the climate velocity part of this. And the question is whether species can keep up with that thermal envelope and survive at the same time. So if you're interested in the mathematical details of it, it's an integral difference model. where we have offspring in the next generation depending on reproduction by adults in the previous generation, multiplied by a dispersal kernel, so the probability of going from point Y to point X, integrated over the thermal envelope for that species. Because we include fishing, the number of adults depends on the number of offspring that landed at a certain location, minus however many were taken by the fishery. Very simple model, one place to start. So to give you a sense of what this looks like, this x-axis is the coastline. This red bar is indicating the range of that thermal envelope. And the y-axis here is just showing you abundance. So if we run this without fishing, with no change in climate, you just get a stable distribution that looks like this. So that's the species distribution. Now if we're going to add in climate velocity, we take this thermal envelope and we're going to shift it off to the right. And we get something like this, where each of these black lines is showing you the species distribution every 10 generations. So we start at generation 0 here, and we end up, in this case, at generation 140. You see the distribution has shifted off to the right as climate velocity has moved along, as the thermal envelope has moved to the right. You'll also see that that there's a cost of experiencing that shifting thermal envelope. You can see that the abundance has declined somewhat and then leveled off in this particular case. So if we add fishing into this, if we add enough fishing in, we see something like this, where you start off in the same place, or close to the same place, though we had fishing, but then because of those cumulative impacts of fishing and climate velocity, this particular population is actually going extinct. And one thing to note is that without climate velocity, this population would have done fine. It would have been a sustainable level of fishing. And without fishing, as I showed you before, this population would have survived climate velocity. So if we want to look at this more systematically, I'll show you, we can look at a graph like this, where we have climate velocity on the x-axis from 0 up to something that's large, and then harvest rate on the y-axis, starting from 0 up to something large. And what we find as a general phenomenon is that somewhere on this graph, there's a horizon. And that horizon separates two end results. Either if you're to the upper right of this horizon, population will go extinct from the combined effects of fishing and climate velocity. So this is climate velocity and fishing are too much for that population to survive. On the other hand, to the lower left, populations are able to persist. The exact location of that horizon depends on a number of factors, including how fast the population grows and the size and shape of the dispersal kernel. So that it'll move up and down and to a certain extent, left to right. But I think one implication of this is that a level of fishing that may be perfectly sustainable with no climate velocity, because this horizon is curved, when you add climate velocity in, that level of fishing may not be sustainable anymore. And obviously that is a concern, because we often don't consider changes in climate in the way we currently manage fisheries. One point though is we've implemented, in the results right here, we've implemented fishing in one specific way. We've assumed that fishing proceeds by taking some constant fraction of the population everywhere, which is, using a constant harvest rate is one commonly recommended way of going about fishing, but it's definitely not the only way of going about it. Another way would be to say, let's just fish those areas that are especially high density, and we'll set a threshold. Maybe we can even take everything above that threshold, but we'll always leave some minimum population, and we won't fish specifically the low density leading edge of these populations. We see a very different kind of interaction between climate and fishing in that case. The interaction is largely eliminated. Yes, you can still fish the population too much and it'll go extinct if you go up above that level. yes, you could still have a climate velocity that's too high, and yes, the population would go extinct if you went off the right-hand side of the graph. But there's very little interaction between the two of them. This horizon has much closer to a 90-degree intersection where those two things come together. So you're much more likely that if a level of fishing is sustainable without climate velocity, it will still be sustainable with climate velocity when the population is experiencing the cumulative impacts of both climate velocity and fishing. So I think the take-home message from that is that fishing can exacerbate the impacts of climate velocity, but depending on how you go about fishing, it doesn't have to. So for the last bit, I want to talk a little bit about how we might go about adapting marine conservation and fisheries management to the impacts of climate velocity. And this is very much sort of thinking in progress, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. I'm sure some people here have been thinking about similar topics. And one of the challenges I see is that many ways we go about setting fisheries management and going about marine conservation by thinking about regulations in certain places in the ocean, including often drawing lines around certain places in the ocean. This is the marine, a large number of marine protected areas that were recently implemented on the coast of California, for example. And many of these areas are set up as conservation zones for the group of marine species that have been found there. So the question is, well, what about when the fish and the species and communities are shifting? When should that affect the way we go about management and conservation? And when might it actually not matter that much? So I think one place where it may matter quite a bit is when you have a species newly shifting into a region. This is one thing that's been quite well described for the English Channel, where species like sea bass and red mullet have been shifting into this region, becoming much more abundant, and have actually provided opportunities for new fisheries to start up. On the other hand, one of the challenges is that when you have a population newly colonized in a new location, we often don't have the scientific information we want to manage fisheries sustainably, just sort of basic population information about how fast they grow, for example. And we also know from invasion theory and from basic ecology that newly colonized populations are especially vulnerable to overharvest. Actually, if you wanted to eradicate an invasive species, you'd want to hit it right in the beginning and hit it hard. So I think if you're interested in healthy populations down the road and robust fisheries down the road, it makes a lot of sense to be especially cautious with emerging fisheries in new regions. The flip side, and I was going to say, there is at least one example where this kind of thinking is being implemented. The Arctic has recently been set aside as an area with a fishing moratorium for the moment, while the basic scientific information is gathered in order to manage fisheries up there sustainably. Arctic is becoming, as you can imagine, is becoming much more accessible to fishing boats, and very real questions about what sorts of fisheries will develop up there. The flip side of new species becoming available, though, is that many of the populations that have traditionally supported important fisheries in many different regions are already or are soon going to be on the decline. And it's not just abundance that goes down, but also the productivity of many of these populations. And that means that the reference levels we use to guide fisheries management will also have to be reduced if we're interested in continuing to fish these populations sustainably. And I think one of the challenges is that those reference levels are often based on historical data that go back decades, and it becomes a question of to what extent can we look to the past to guide a future that's quite a bit different. These are just two species likely to decline in the Northeast. So there's also the question of closed areas, and I think how we go about adapting closed areas depends a lot on for what purpose they were set up. I'm showing you one example of something called the place box in the North Sea. Place is a kind of ground fish found in the North Sea, and this closed area had been set up to protect juvenile place so they weren't caught by the fishery. On the other hand, it's warmed quite a bit in shallow waters of the North Sea, and the juvenile plates have now shifted into deeper water, where they've again become vulnerable to the fishery. Because this closed area had a very specific purpose for this species, I think it would make a lot of sense to shift that closed area to continue to serve the same purpose. On the other hand, if you have a set of marine protected areas set up to protect a community or more of ecosystem processes, it may instead make sense to just allow that mix of species to change over naturally, but just instead ensure that you have a network of protected areas arrayed along a coastline so that species can continue to be protected in the potentially the next closed area north as they shift. So I think one of the key points, though, is that we're not necessarily flying blind here. We have increasingly many tools to at least put bounds on what future conditions are likely to look like. This map is showing projections of how much surface temperature is projected to increase in many parts of North America. It's a model from the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab down in Princeton. And we can increasingly start to use these models to try to understand where and to a certain extent how abundant species may be in different regions in the future. It's something I've just started to step into, and I wanted to show you a couple of these very preliminary results. So we've been pulling down the IPCC class models that are part of the 5th assessment report that's about to come out, and using those to project climate velocities forward and understand how much thermal habitat will be available to species in different regions of North America. So this is one example, cod in the Northeast US. In these box plots, the left-hand column shows you the amount of thermal habitat available to cod historically, so over the last few decades. Project that forward to the middle of the century, and in this case we see that we expect to see less suitable thermal habitat in the Northeast US. This range is across 13 different climate models, global climate models, downscale to the Northeast US. And then towards the end of the century, we expect to see even less thermal habitat available for cod. It's not the same story for all species, though. For lobster, for example, the projections are actually that conditions will become more suitable by the middle of the century, though that's largely, almost entirely up in the northern part of the Northeast US. The mean latitude of those thermal envelopes also shifts north substantially. Places like Long Island Sound are projected to, for the most part, be too warm in the future. But then for lobster, we see crashes towards the end of the century, as even up in the northern part of New England, conditions are expected to become too warm. And then there are some species like squid projected to actually have increased thermal habitat suitability going forward, even towards the end of the century. So obviously, these are quite simple models. They're just looking at thermal habitat. These are complex ecosystems, and they're likely to be surprises. And I think that's another important part of the story, is that we have a large number of tools, increasingly a lot of really impressive tools for understanding when the environment changes quickly, when it changes in ways we don't expect, and how that's affecting the ecosystem. And I think the challenge is, how do we integrate information from satellites and underwater robots and buoys and surveys that happen every year, and get that quickly and efficiently into marine conservation when it's important to get into those processes, and also into the fisheries management process, which largely has actually ignored changes in the environment. I think the last point I wanted to make on this topic was that at its core, adaptation to climate change is about individuals choosing to change their behavior. So that might mean fishermen that decide to travel further in search of fish. It might mean learning how to, or deciding to switch to a new species and getting the gear and permits and everything in order to do that. Those are often costly, often difficult decisions. So where there are barriers to adaptation that have been put up, and where it makes sense, where we're able to reduce those barriers without getting in the way of current or future sustainability of a fishery or of a population, I think it makes sense to do that. There's definitely been a shift in recent decades towards making adaptation much more difficult. Permits are often, for example, very hard to get in new fisheries. So I think the broader point I want to make is that we have a large number of tools and strategies available to us now to start thinking about adaptation both in marine conservation and fisheries. And it's just the hard part is now starting to implement this. So just to wrap up, I wanted to give you some sense of where I'm interested in going in the future. I mentioned and showed you some preliminary results for some of the projections we're starting to do by downscaling the global climate models to each of the regions where we've been looking at climate velocity and shifts in species distribution. But I'm also really interested in how species interactions play into this. Predator-prey relationships in particular. We've been building, similar to the cumulative impacts model I showed you earlier, we've been building a food web model that's actually informed by body sizes and includes thermal envelopes as well as sort of built off of metabolic ecology. And we're starting to explore the interaction between these processes with that sort of model. Also really interested in how ocean currents play into the either enhance or limit the ability of species to keep up with climate velocities. Along with Enrique Kirchitzer and some other oceanographers, been reconstructing larval dispersal trajectories on the east coast of the U.S. for the last 50 years. This is just one particular run of that. And then actually with Janet Nye and Hayami Kim here, we're starting to look at summer flounder as one specific example, and actually using genetics to try to reconstruct larval dispersal patterns empirically in that species going back 20 years. Right? Some really impressive collections of larvae that have been made that we can use to do that work. Really excited to get started on that. And then the final direction I think that's really interesting, I alluded to this before, is if we've seen adaptation at sort of the fishery scale, but what does that actually mean for individual fishermen, and how are fishermen adapting to some of these changes? And that's a project that's getting off the ground with some anthropologists down at Rutgers, Kevin St. Martin and Bonnie McKay. So just to summarize, I started out the talk showing you at a North American scale and using a large data set and a bunch of analyses. It does seem like marine species are following local climate velocities. I think this helps explain to a large extent the variation among species that we've been observing so far, and also potentially gives us a tool to project forward in terms of where these species are likely to be. Then showed you some examples from the Northeast US where it looks like fisheries are following these species north, but also seem to be lagging behind quite a bit for a range of regulatory, economic, and social reasons. Then used a model to show you that it looks like fisheries can really exacerbate the impacts of climate velocity, but that depends on how we go about fishing, and there are ways to minimize that impact, especially by avoiding fishing the leading edge of these populations. And then finally, I made the argument that we have a number of tools to begin adapting to these changes now, but it's going to be a matter of implementing them in the way we actually go about conservation and management. So with that, I just wanted to thank a large number of collaborators on these various projects. It's been a lot of fun getting these up and running and working on them, and a lot of work still to do. Large number of people to thank for data, and these are actually just the people who actually provided the data. There are even larger number of people who are actually out on the boats doing all the hard work to collect these data over decades. It's really impressive, and impressive that these data sets have been maintained. They're incredibly valuable. And then funding, as Janet mentioned, from the Smith Fellowship Program and the Society for Conservation Biology for a lot of this work. And Sea Grant to thank going forward for some of this. So thanks a lot.
Okay, so we have about 5 or 10 minutes or so.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for a very interesting talk. You acknowledge Fisheries and Oceans Canada at the beginning. I'm just wondering what your Canadian colleagues are up to, because if you look at the geography of the east coast of Canada, you've got the Bay of Fundy, right? The world's highest tides. And then you've got the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Then you go around the Flemish Cap and you've got the Labrador Sea. These are very different oceanographic regimes, and they don't have such a nice trending north-south coastline like we have here. So I'm just wondering, what are the Canadians doing, and have you been collaborating with them on these sort of ideas?
Well, very much so in terms of actually pulling the data sets together. Yeah, and they're really interested in these processes as well. And it's interesting, you know, I think at a regional level, a lot of the research being done is really focused on how species interactions actually play into this. It's interesting, in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, they're interested in climate, and they've been tracking changes in climate, but have really been focused on how the recovery of seals has been affecting dynamics of fish in that particular ecosystem. And on the Scotian Shelf, they've been really interested in impacts of food chains and sort of overfishing of cod and how that's filtered down through it. But it's interesting, especially looking at the projections. So places like Newfoundland actually projected to have more suitable, at least thermal habitat going forward. And this is a place, obviously, that there's been a huge collapse in cod. So potentially this is something that would help cod recover in the future. That would be interesting to try to work through that more going forward. Yeah.
I don't know about other regions, but in the Northeast, the fishery surveys occur in the spring and in the fall.
They do.
And don't cover the extreme periods in the winter and summer. Can you comment on whether that could impact your results?
So yeah, I mean, as I'm sure you can tell, you know, these are all of the results apply to a certain season because they're not annual surveys. Though it's interesting, the spring survey captures some of the coldest temperatures actually around the year, and the fall survey captures some of the warmest. Just because those warm temperatures bleed into the beginning of the survey, and the cold temperatures actually, it keeps cooling through much of the spring. So I think we at least come very close to capturing the extreme temperatures in those particular surveys. But you bring up an interesting point about, you know, many of these species are changing their distributions even within a year, and it would be one thing we haven't done yet, but I would love to do, is even look between those two surveys to see if we can predict changes seasonally within a year based on thermal envelopes. You know, I expect our ability would be more limited, especially at least transferring between seasons, because you know there's bathymetry, and many of these species are following seasonal migrations for spawning or following food or avoiding predators. But I think within a season, that where they end up may be still quite closely tied to thermal conditions, and I think that's what we're picking up. Thank you.
Yeah, this isn't my question, but before I get to my question, just follow up on Bob's comment. If you look at the state surveys that are conducted on a monthly level, you can actually see that whether a species is in a particular area is extremely dependent on the timing of the survey, in the spring and the fall. So essentially, if you just think about normal distribution moving north or south, where you land on that really affects whether you have a high abundance year or low abundance year in the survey. For some, actually a lot of the species that NIMS assesses, which is I don't know how you deal with that. It's a problem, but it would be interesting to try to incorporate that into specifically the species movement patterns and timing into the model. But actually, my question had to do with looking at the mechanisms, how able a species is to move along with the climate velocity. And I was just thinking when you were presenting the model, I guess you're working with your students.
With what?
The model that you showed, I think you were developing with 2 students. With the dispersal kernels and so forth. Whether or not you think you could take that model and start asking questions, for instance, if the climate is changing such that you might see a limit in the time, both the temporal and the spatial extent that larvae could be successful, depending on the species. So you could look at how the dispersal might be affected by these changes versus how movement from other stages, juvenile or adult stages. So you could look at the rate that a species is observed to change its range and look at whether it's more likely to be driven by a larval mechanism or some kind of adult mechanism.
Yeah, I mean I think that what mechanism underlies these shifts that we've seen is a fascinating question that I'm really interested in. You know, because in addition to adult dispersal or larval dispersal, it could also be just changes in growth rates. You know, if you have southern populations declining and northern populations growing, it'll still appear as a shift northward. Yeah, I mean, if you have a species, maybe you have something in mind where we understand the larval ecology well enough to say that, you know, the window in which larvae can survive has shrunk. I think that would be really interesting to try to follow up on it. It's easy to implement in the kind of model we have in terms of changing the size or shape of the dispersal kernel. Or sort of in a more specific way, sort of when I mentioned the oceanographic simulations that we're doing, we can actually do something more specific and targeted at a particular species and try to reconstruct dispersal patterns over the last half century. That'd be really fun to do.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting. I'm also concerned that we know very little about drivers of adult movement. I mean, some of the changes you showed were pretty large. It's somewhat hard for me to imagine, unless they're very incremental, that they could have been driven by larval dispersal. So I think the Hague example you showed,
right.
if they're not the local growth phenomena that you discussed, and I'm just wondering how they're doing that.
If it's larval dispersal, you'd expect, they're not going to show up in the surveys until they disperse and then grow,
Right.
which would be tied to generation time and growth rates. We do see growth rate being important, but as you saw, it's a relatively minor factor compared to the other ones. Saw someone back here, but otherwise we can go to Hans.
I just have a very quick one.
Yeah.
I was surprised that the bottom troll survey, which I understand needs to have some soft bottom or sandy bottom, that they catch lobster.
Yeah, I know. It's.
I'm puzzled with that. Can you representatively catch lobster.
Lobster makes a nice example because people recognize it. But the connection between the inshore lobster fishery that we're all familiar with and the offshore population, it's sometimes a little bit trickier to know exactly. It's probably, there's a meta-population. There is dispersal between the two. There's also some migration probably, but it's not necessarily a one-to-one connection. On the other hand, at least anecdotally, there have been, there's a collapse of the lobster population in Long Island Sound tied to high temperatures. So probably similar things going on even near shore compared to what we see offshore. And they're caught actually very commonly in the bottom trawl survey. Yeah.
I have two quick questions. One is, since the places are moving, has anybody proposed changing their name?
I haven't heard that, but I'm not, I'm not based in Europe, so maybe someone has.
My other question is, I think when you were talking about the interaction between fisheries and extinction, you said that without fishing, you expect abundance declines as the temperature changes. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah. So.
Why?
Yeah, good question. So there is a cost to keeping up with climate velocity. So in our model, it's a dispersal kernel as if it's larval dispersal. So it's not directed. These are not fish swimming to keep up with their optimal thermal habitat. So if you think about completely stationary climate and you have a dispersal kernel, you're right in the middle of it. And that's where most of your larvae are going to end up. And so you have a relatively large number of offspring in the following generation. If instead, where your offspring are able to survive is way over here, out in the tail of that distribution, you have fewer offspring that survive in the next generation. So that's why that effect shows up in the model that we've put together. It's almost a geometric explanation. Yeah.
I think the zootoxic stress might have contributed to your Gulf of Mexico anomaly.
I'm sure that is part of the story, yes. I think the dead zone has been growing over that time period and would tend to shift species in that direction. On the other hand, it makes a lot of sense from from changes in climate that we've been seeing. And I don't yet know how to tease those two apart without looking in a very detailed way at maybe some of the species down there and trying to pull in all the data together. I haven't gone that direction, but that would definitely be interesting to try to tease those two apart. I think that's where we actually, with a couple other colleagues, we've proposed a session for the Ecological Society of America meeting next summer to try to pull people together who are doing this. You know, how does climate add up with oxygen and fishing and change, on land for its changes in habitat? How do these all come together, I think is an important thing to try to figure out next.
Maybe one more question and then we can continue the conversation at lunch.
Sounds good.
I guess I have 2 questions, so I'll just do one of them. So you make the argument that fishing mortality can interact with the shifting climate envelope or climate velocity, kind of chop off the southern tail of the distribution and accelerate it. I was wondering if sort of the first part of the talk, when you're just doing the basic comparison of climate and population velocity, whether you thought about or tried to account for the effects that fishing might have in affecting that the population velocity, since you also have the fisheries landing data.
Right. Yeah. So somewhat is the answer. So I went by it pretty quickly, but we looked at, there was the part of the analysis where we looked at the rate at which species were shifting, and one of the correlates that we looked at was whether they were commercially fished or not. And the coefficient on that term is positive, which actually lines up with what we found. So it implies that commercially fished species tend to be shifting faster than ones that aren't commercially fished, which didn't make any sense to me until we sort of worked through the red hake example and thought about, okay, well, yeah, if you're lagging behind and you fish the trailing edge, maybe you would shift faster. So it appears it's a very weak effect. And also, it's a very coarse correlate. It's not accounting for where those landings were taken. It's just whether they were taken or not. As part of this summer flounder project, we may be trying to go that next step, because we actually know spatially where the landings were going back, at least back into the 70s. So you can actually fit a spatial population dynamics model and try to tease out what the relative effects of fishing and climate are on that population. So I think that'll be really fun to do.
Okay, well, let's